WikiLeaks is raising a €100,000 reward for Europe's most wanted secret, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership.
This is something enormous. It is about a final control, and it's the United States saying there may be another power in the world, but we will be the ultimate power.
The TTIP is the most important thing that is happening in Europe right now. It's a secretive deal being negotiated between Europe and the United States.
Once signed, it will cement a key part of the US government's plan to create a new global bloc that will ensure the dominance of its largest companies. And to understand why, we need to go back to the 1950s.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA.
After the Second World War, the United States accounted for half of the world's economy. Its influence was unmatched by any country, and it was able to write the early rules of international trade to its advantage. The World Trade Organization was created in this context, and the US dictated rules that favored American business. But as economies like China and India joined the WTO, it became a more democratized arena, and the US found it harder to control its decision-making.
At the WTO, at its Doha rounds, India spoke up and Brazil spoke up, and the US lost control.
I think it's no use beating around the bush. This meeting has collapsed.
The US felt it needed a new strategy to maintain its global dominance. So in the classical American style, they went big. To bypass the WTO, they're creating the biggest international agreements that the world has ever seen. They're called the Three Big T's: the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, and the Trade in Services Agreement, or TISA. And they're all being negotiated in secret right now.
We only found out when WikiLeaks was able to leak parts of them.
And what's interesting is when you look across all of these deals, whether it be TTIP, TPP or TISA, China is excluded, but also Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, they're all excluded because those are the emerging economies.
What is not often understood is that these agreements are part of a geopolitical war. This is a new war which is taking place between the United States and China. The United States is very scared of the rise of China, so it has moved to militarily encircle it through what is called the pivot to Asia, and now it's moving on to doing that economically.
The basic idea which comes across from reading US strategy papers is the construction of a new grand enclosure. And to put inside this grand enclosure, the United States, 51 other countries, 1.6 billion people, and 2/3 of global GDP. To integrate Latin America away from Brazil and towards the United States, to integrate Southeast Asia away from China and towards the United States, and to integrate Western Europe, pulling it away from Eurasia as a whole and towards the Atlantic.
Of the three big T's, WikiLeaks has revealed 4 chapters of the TPP, which affects 12 countries in the Americas and Southeast Asia. We also obtained and released the core text of TISA, which affects 52 countries, including the EU. But nearly all of TTIP is still secret. When signed, TTIP will cover half of global GDP and will affect every European member state. Yet EU parliamentarians have serious restrictions in accessing the proposed agreement.
Yeah, I found it incredible as well that for something which is a trade agreement, not a matter of life and death in terms of security, where maybe you can understand some restrictions, and we don't even like those very much, but for a trade agreement, you know, that we can't actually make notes about what it is we're reading, issues that we might want to take away to look into, which actually might reassure us, you know, if we really were able to sort of take this away and look at it in depth.
We don't have access to the key documents, the most important ones, because the devil is in the detail. When it comes to trade agreements, you need to know exactly what's in the text so that you can assess what the impact's going to be.
If EU parliamentarians want to see the TTIP, they have to call the US embassy and make an appointment. The appointments are only available 2 days a week for 2-hour time slots. Only 2 parliamentarians are permitted at once. They go to the US embassy, they have to hand in every electronic device, so they cannot possibly make a copy. They must agree to keep everything confidential, and then they're led to a secure reading room where 2 US embassy guards watch everything that they do. How can EU parliamentarians possibly understand what they're negotiating for Europe under these circumstances?
The world's biggest corporations don't have the same problem. They have been receiving VIP access from day one and have had abundant influence in the negotiations.
People, the likes of you and I, are excluded. Governments, to a great extent, are excluded. Those who are included are the multinational corporations.
These agreements are basically corporate ownership agreements. The funny thing about free trade agreements, as we understand them, is they often have nothing to do with trade in the sense of the mutual lowering of tariffs. What they're about is enshrining an investor rights regime in the respective countries and ensuring that corporations can run wild in the respective economies with very, very little regulation or impingement by government or authorities.
These treaties will have huge, huge implications for literally almost every critical issue that an individual citizen or community would care about: health, education, the environment, privacy, access to medicines. I mean, the list could go on.
One of the most criticised aspects of TTIP is a system called the Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. It's a secretive international tribunal that allows companies to sue states over virtually anything that they can claim affects their investment.
If a protest affects their profits, they can sue. If laws affect their profits, they can sue. If new regulations might impact what they want to do with their money, they can sue.
This is a new power which will be handed over to US corporations to sue the governments of Europe in a parallel judicial system which is available to them alone. So people have no access to it, domestic firms have no access to it, governments have no access to it. It's just there for foreign investors, in this case, US corporations.
Based on ISDS history, critics argue that European state sovereignty and democracy are at serious risk. Previous lawsuits include Swedish company Vattenfall suing the German state for $3.7 billion for phasing out nuclear energy. British American Tobacco sued Australia for passing a law limiting cigarette advertising. The French company Veolia sued Egypt for raising the minimum wage. TTIP advocates say that in order for the EU and US to become a single market, regulatory barriers need to be eliminated. This way, for example, a US seatbelt manufacturer already selling seatbelts domestically wouldn't need to test for safety a second time, as the EU would agree to recognise the US safety standards. They argue that this would save costs, create jobs, and lower prices for consumers. But just how safe are US standards?
So in the USA, 70% of all processed food sold in supermarkets contains genetically modified ingredients, whereas in the European Union, we've said quite clearly we don't want GM ingredients in our food chain. Similarly, in the US, 90% of all beef is produced using growth hormones, which have been found to be carcinogenic in humans. So they're banned in the European Union. And what the US government is saying is that under TTIP, under the free trade rules that they want to bring in, European consumers don't get the right to choose.
TTIP includes all the most important public sectors in Europe, including education, water, railways, postal services, and most controversially, it also includes public health services.
What is so scary about this is that corporations want to lock in their power. So they not only want increased power, but they want to make it impossible for sovereign governments to reverse the changes which are going to give them power. So, for example, with TTIP, if it passes with ISDS in it, the privatisation of the National Health Service, which is happening in the UK, can never be reversed.
What is democratic about an enormous imposition of power on countries whose citizens have no way of knowing what's going on, of debating it, or influencing their government in its decision. That's anti-democratic.
The history of these agreements shows that they're very difficult to change unless people can see what's in them. And that's why they're kept secret. Because when the contents are revealed, it generates an opposition.
WikiLeaks has had considerable success delaying the TPP and opening up the debate around it and the teaser by releasing the secret draft texts. Our publication of an earlier proposed US-EU agreement, the ACTA, killed it entirely. WikiLeaks is raising a €100,000 reward for Europe's most wanted secret, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Help the world become a more transparent place. Do your part. Go to wikileaks.org/TTIP-reward.
Good day. This is Dr. Conrad Miller, MD, and I'm here today to talk to you about the worst thing happening on the planet right now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, abbreviated TPP, which involves 800 million people, 40% of the economic activity on the earth, and is the largest free trade deal ever produced in the history of the earth. But you haven't heard about it because it's not on your radio, it's not on your TV, unfortunately. They've had 24 meetings in secret over the last several years, mostly corporations and trade representatives of 12 countries around the Pacific Rim, including the United States, Canada, Peru, Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the door is being left open for China, South Korea, Russia, India, and any other countries that will step in. Okay, the big thing is that corporations, as if they were states, can challenge countries, any law in these countries, for example, federal, state, or local laws in the United States, in secret courts or tribunals where three men, usually it's men that are the judges, they're all trade lawyers, usually decide in favor of the corporation 90% of the time or more, as in NAFTA or the World Trade Organization, previous free trade agreements, that whatever law is challenged is an illegal barrier to free trade and it has to be changed or eliminated, or the country has to pay expected future profits that could have been made because the law was enacted. Of course, nobody wants to pay those. So in these courts, the corporations are empowered to sue for environmental laws, health laws, consumer laws, zoning laws, or any other public policies that the corporations claim are either undermining their rights or diminishing their expected future profits. And when these rulings are made in secret, no affected parties can attend the tribunals, including small business owners or workers, local residents, or potentially poisoned people. Just the lawyers for the corporations and those of the challenged country are allowed to attend these tribunals behind closed doors. And the judges one day may be lobbyists for the corporations, and the next day they may be judges. Just three of them. And this is called the Investor-State Dispute Settlement. The most horrific thing about these courts or tribunals is that once a decision is made, there can be no appeal to a real court, because the TPP tribunals will be the highest court, above our Supreme Court, if we sign on to this trade agreement. Sign the TPP, we sign away our country's sovereignty and democratic rights as trade agreements supersede national laws. For what we would be doing to ourselves is putting the hammer down for the corporations and banks to tighten their grip on the new world order we keep grimly hearing about. So all of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they've met in secret. They've developed 29 chapters and only 5 deal with tariff and trade. and the rest protect the corporations, or as Jim Hightower says, the other 24 chapters consist of various ways to free rapacious corporations from any accountability for the havoc they wreak and from any responsibility to the world community's common good. So that's what can happen in the trade courts. Now, specifically, there are things that are written up about food safety. For example, in the United States, we have the highest food standards, and we have to harmonize ours down to international standards. Things that also can be challenged are the labeling of genetically modified food. 90% of Americans want their GMOs labeled, their soy, their canola, their cottonseed oil. And some states have passed laws that will make it necessary to label genetically modified organisms in crops and food. But these laws can be challenged in these little trade courts or tribunals. Mexico, for example, in 2000, the Senate unanimously backed GMO food labeling, and within 3 months the United States threatened to impose sanctions via NAFTA, that was the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the decision was reversed. Then there's also country of origin labeling for meat, and 90% of Americans also favor that, and that can be challenged. Then there's the internet. You can go to the internet, we can look up things very quickly, we can see how a jellyfish swims, or how the weather is in Austin, Texas in a few seconds. There was a battle over this and net neutrality that we did win in the United States, where the corporations like AT&T and Comcast wanted to make a slow lane for average users and a fast lane for corporate users. But with the TPP, it's already been set up for corporate created content, giving copyright protection for that for 120 years. And the deal will also transform internet service providers into a private Big Brother police force empowered to monitor our user activity, arbitrarily take down our content, and cut off our access to the internet. Now, we also have Buy America, Buy Austin, Buy Our Own Country, and we have these deals for government procurement where, for example, the government buys cars or only buys things that aren't made by child labor. And the U.S. procurement market is $1.7 trillion, very big market. Everybody wants to get into it. All the TPP countries want to get into it. And the TPP locks in and expands privatization and deregulation of public services. And now, public services that weren't accessible to corporations will be under the TPP, including transportation, water treatment, corrections, education, healthcare. Then there's fracking, where the Department of Energy will lose control over how much fracking is done, and the environmental impact will not be studied. It's important because Japan, one of the main countries in the TPP, is the world's largest natural gas importer, so we would expect more fracking to be done in the United States and lose control of how much is done and what environmental damages result. Then we'll lose a lot of jobs. We've already lost about 6 million jobs because of the various trade agreements that exist. And the U.S. corporations would get special foreign investor protection to limit the cost and risk of relocating their factories to low-wage nations that sign on to this agreement. But Vietnam, for example, the United States Department of Labor has cited Vietnam as one of only 3 countries in the world to engage in forced child labor in its apparel industry. Plus, surveys cited unsafe working conditions in its apparel industry. This is important because Vietnam is the second largest exporter of apparel to the United States, behind only China. Instead of suspending trade talks with Vietnam until it meets basic international standards for human and workers' rights, we're rewarding them with duty-free access. The TPP would block federal, state, and local governments from taking action to boost job creation, which is kind of outrageous. And then we have the banks. The banks are one of the big authors of most of these other 24 chapters in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. and they basically don't want any of the rules that normally would protect the government, the people, from the banks, like transaction taxes, or also called Robin Hood taxes, which are already approved in 11 European countries. That's imposing a tiny tax on Wall Street transactions to tamp down speculation-fueled volatility while generating hundreds of billions of dollars worth of revenue for social, health, or environmental causes. Then there are firewall reforms that have been blocked by the banks writing them into the TPP. TPP could ban capital controls, which even the International Monetary Fund is in favor of. Basically, extreme deregulation is the problem, and we know that hasn't worked in the United States, and now the TPP is taking that up. So basically, the TPP creates permanent corporate rule over us and all the other countries in the TPP. If we want to make a change in the TPP, we have to get all 12 countries to agree to that change. Otherwise, nothing can be changed. In 2010, all the nations involved signed a formal pledge to keep the details of their deliberations from the public and to keep documents related to the deal undercover until 4 years after the process is completed. And Ron Kirk, who was Barack Obama's top trade representative, said that locking out the people is necessary because the deal's details would outrage Americans and spook Congress from rubber stamping it. So even though Congress has to regulate commerce with foreign nations, the game is President Obama and the Republicans especially want to, instead of open the whole TPP to Congress and review everything, they want to fast track it, which means everybody can only vote yes or no on the whole deal, one way or the other, and that's the end of it. So the ultimate answer is we've stopped things like this before. We have to say no to fast track, which may come up in the Congress in March. It may take 60 days to pass. If not, we can block the Trans-Pacific Partnership and fast track. You can call 202-224-3121 and call your congressman, and we'll leave some other numbers and contacts for you. This is Dr. Conrad Miller. Thank you very much. No to fast track, no to the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Was ist TTIP? TTIP steht für Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, das geplante Freihandelsabkommen zwischen der EU und den USA. Freier Handel? Ist doch großartig. Frei! Ohne Hemmnisse, ohne Einschränkungen, gleichberechtigt die Chancen nutzen. Amerikanische Waren können in Europa günstiger, weil ohne Zoll verkauft werden. Umgekehrt werden auch europäische Waren in den USA billiger. Am Ende gibt es mehr Handel und damit mehr Reichtum für alle. 545 € wird jeder Haushalt davon haben. Das wirst du noch 100 Mal in den nächsten Monaten in den Medien hören. Von dir wird erwartet, dass du freudig nickend nichts tust. Vor allem solltest du jetzt nicht beginnen nachzurechnen. Wer rechnet schon freiwillig? Wenn du es aber doch tust, wirst du sehen, dass die angewandte Methode eine Mischung aus Mathematik, Schätzungen und viel Wunschdenken ist. Mit ein paar weniger optimistischen Annahmen kann der Gewinn dabei auch schnell zum Verlust werden. Aber vielleicht ist der TTIP eine gute Sache, ganz unabhängig davon, ob irgendwelche Haushalte irgendwann Geld bekommen und wie viel. Schließlich geht es um Freiheit, um Sicherheit. Investitionssicherheit für Konzerne nämlich. Stellen wir uns einen lieben europäischen Konzern vor, der ein Stahlwerk in die amerikanische Prärie stellen möchte. Dort ist er doch der Willkür der dortigen Gerichte schutzlos ausgeliefert. Da ist es doch toll, wenn man die unberechenbare, gemeine Justiz durch Schiedsgerichte ersetzt, wo ehrliche Anwälte zusammensitzen und Schiedsrichter verbindliche Entscheidungen treffen können, ganz ohne Berufungsmöglichkeit und nervender Öffentlichkeit, hinter verschlossenen Türen. Klingt doch gut, oder? Nun, das Schiedsgerichtsbusiness ist ein kräftig wachsender Sektor und es gibt bereits hunderte Klagen von Konzernen gegen Staaten. Wie viele es genau sind, ist jedoch schwer zu sagen. Wir hatten uns doch auf Stillschweigen geeinigt. Ein paar Klagen sind aber öffentlich bekannt. Wegen dem Atomausstieg wird Deutschland vom Energiekonzern Vattenfall auf Schadenersatz geklagt. Der Marlboro-Hersteller Philip Morris klagt Australien und Uruguay auf Schadenersatz wegen der gesetzlich notwendigen Warnhinweise auf Zigarettenverpackungen. Und der Öl- und Gaskonzern Lone Pine klagt den kanadischen Staat wegen des Verbots von Fracking in Quebec. Entscheidet das Schiedsgericht im Sinne eines Konzerns, werden Milliarden an Steuergeldern an private Firmen verschoben. Die Entscheidungsgrundlagen bleiben dabei häufig geheim. Womöglich erfährt die Öffentlichkeit nicht einmal von dem Verfahren. Nur das Geld wird plötzlich bei Bildung, Gesundheit und Infrastruktur fehlen. Mit TTIP kann das souveräne Recht von Demokratien, Gesetze zu ändern und Sozial- und Umweltstandards zu heben, eine extrem kostspielige Angelegenheit werden. Entscheidungen über Milliarden hinter verschlossenen Türen. Wer das als Einladung zur Korruption sieht, wird nicht enttäuscht werden. Aber ist das nicht ein ungeheurer Vorwurf? Die Schiedsrichter sind hoch angesehene Anwälte und Juristinnen, die, so wird uns versichert, natürlich nur im Sinne der Sache entscheiden. So wie die Schweizer Professorin Gabriele Kaufmann-Kohler, die als Schiedsrichterin Argentinien zu einer 100 Millionen $ Zahlung an den Konzern Vivendi verurteilte, aber sich durch den Umstand, dass sie während dem Verfahren zufällig einen Vorstandsjob bei der UBS, Anteilseignerin bei Vivendi, erhielt, sicher nicht beeinflussen ließ. Und was ist der Vorteil für eine normale Steuerzahlerin? Für den kleinen Betrieb, der immer wieder sein Geschäftsmodell an geänderte wirtschaftliche und gesetzliche Bedingungen anpassen muss? Richtig, gar keiner. Teure Schiedsgerichtsverfahren können sich nur große Konzerne leisten. In den Zeitungen wird auch zu lesen sein, deine Sorgen, TTIP würde zu einer Aufweichung von strengen Umwelt- und Sozialstandards führen, seien total unbegründet. Weder wird es erlaubt werden, wie in den USA, Hühner unter so schrecklichen Bedingungen zu halten, dass ihr Fleisch erst nach einem Bad im Chlor überhaupt genießbar ist, noch wird es gentechnisch veränderte Lebensmittel und routinemäßige Hormonbehandlungen für Rinder geben. Schöne Versprechen. Aber frag nach, an wen du dich wenden kannst, wenn sie gebrochen werden. Die Schiedsgerichte, die hinter verschlossenen Türen Milliardenbeträge an Schadenersatz zusprechen, sind dafür ganz sicher nicht gedacht.